The story of female nurses on the Eastern Front is one of extraordinary endurance, profound suffering, and unwavering devotion in the face of a conflict that remains one of the most brutal in human history. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, few could have anticipated the staggering scale of the violence that would soon engulf the lands between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Amid this vast confrontation, where cities burned, armies collapsed, and millions perished, tens of thousands of women served as nurses, medical assistants, orderlies, and field caregivers in conditions that defied every expectation of human resilience. Drawn by duty, ideology, professional calling, or the simple desire to serve, these women were thrust into a war zone unlike anything Europe had previously witnessed, where the lines between front and rear collapsed rapidly, and where chaos, trauma, and death became an inescapable part of everyday life. Their service extended far beyond conventional nursing work. They performed surgeries under bombardment, administered care to men dying in trenches or forests, evacuated wounded soldiers at night under fire, and attempted to preserve fragments of humanity in spaces where civilization had all but disintegrated. The Eastern Front was defined by extremes, extreme weather, extreme violence, extreme deprivation, and the nurses who served there were forced to operate with few resources, little rest, and no real protection from the horrors unfolding around them. Many were scarcely trained before being deployed. Others, already qualified in civilian life, quickly realized that wartime medicine required improvisation over textbook technique. Supplies dwindled within months, and hospitals struggled under impossible strain as tens of thousands of injured men poured in during major offensives. Nurses reused bandages, sterilized instruments over small stoves, and rationed medications to the point of heartbreak, knowing that some patients could have survived had resources been more readily available. Yet for all the medical challenges, the psychological burden was perhaps even greater. They witnessed catastrophic injuries, heard the final words of countless dying soldiers, and often formed emotional bonds with men who did not live to see another dawn. The shock of treating teenage soldiers, the helplessness of watching amputations performed without proper anesthesia, and the endless repetition of death created scars that would remain long after the war ended. Their days blurred into nights, sleep came in fragments. Hunger and sickness became constant companions. Journeys that should have taken hours stretched into days as they evacuated wounded men over roads choked with mud, ice, refugees, and retreating armies. They endured bombardment, sudden Soviet breakthroughs, collapsing trenches, and desperate retreats where the slightest delay could mean encirclement or capture. When the front buckled in 1943 and the German army began its slow collapse westward, nurses found themselves thrust into even more terrifying conditions. Hospitals became temporary shelters on the run, packed, freezing, disease-ridden places where the wounded lay in hallways, on floors, and outside in the snow while shells exploded nearby. Nurses carried stretchers through burning villages, shielded patients from shrapnel with their own bodies, and fought exhaustion until they could no longer stand. Many were captured, some were killed, others disappeared without a trace in the vast expanse of the front. Stories of encounters with the advancing Red Army, ranging from orderly processing to violent assault, created a climate of fear that overshadowed every evacuation. Nurses removed insignia, hid in barns or forests, or stayed behind with hopelessly wounded men, knowing what likely awaited them. Even behind the lines, dangers multiplied. Partisans ambushed convoys, disease spread uncontrollably, and shortages of food and medicine forced painful ethical decisions about who could be saved. Those who survived often returned home to devastation. A family lost, a city leveled, a life irreparably changed. Their testimonies reveal not only the brutal conditions they endured, but also their extraordinary resilience and humanity. Some wrote diaries that detailed the agony of operating under lantern light in freezing temperatures. Others described how they held the hands of dying soldiers so they would not pass alone. Still others confessed that the bonds formed with fellow nurses were the only thing that kept them emotionally alive. In the post-war years, however, their experiences were frequently forgotten or overshadowed. Many were denied recognition because of their association with the defeated German military, while others remained silent out of shame, trauma, or fear of being misunderstood. Only decades later did historians begin to appreciate the essential, though often overlooked role these women played in supporting the war machine, even as they themselves endured suffering on a scale comparable to frontline soldiers. Their legacy lies not in the cause they served, but in their acts of compassion amid devastation, their courage under fire, and the emotive power of their recollections, which illuminate the hidden human dimensions of a war too vast to comprehend without the personal stories that give it shape. The female nurses of the Eastern Front occupy a unique and deeply poignant place in the history of World War II, a testament to the resilience of women in wartime, the moral complexities of service within a violent regime, and the enduring human instinct to provide care even in the darkest of circumstances. Their service is not simply a chapter of military history, but a profound narrative of survival, sacrifice, and the fragile persistence of humanity where it was most severely tested. The outbreak of the war on the Eastern Front in 1941 brought with it a profound transformation in how societies mobilized their resources, and nowhere was this more evident than in the unprecedented enlistment and deployment of female nurses across the vast expanse of the German-Soviet battlefield. From the moment Operation Barbarossa commenced, the scale of casualties overwhelmed existing medical infrastructure, compelling military planners, civilian organizations, and charitable institutions to recognize that the contribution of women was not merely desirable, but indispensable. Thousands of young women, some trained nurses, others volunteers with only rudimentary medical knowledge, answered calls issued by the Red Cross, church networks, women's associations, and military recruitment boards. They volunteered out of patriotism, a sense of duty, personal conviction, or the desire for adventure. Yet many soon discovered that the war they thought they understood from newspapers and radio broadcasts bore little resemblance to the brutal reality awaiting them on the front lines. These women were swept into a system that both relied on and exploited their labor, placing them in an environment of constant danger, emotional strain, and relentless work that stretched far beyond anything envisioned in pre-war nursing curricula. Mobilization began in the cities, where posters urged women to support the fatherland by caring for wounded soldiers. Medical academies condensed crash courses into weeks instead of years, emphasizing battlefield first aid, triage, infectious disease control, and emergency surgery preparation. Many aspiring nurses practiced on dummies, livestock, or each other, knowing that within days they might be bandaging real shrapnel wounds or assisting with amputations. Recruiters emphasized the honor of service and the noble calling of healing, but they rarely discussed the bitter cold, the lice, the exhaustion, the screams of men dying from wounds beyond medical repair, or the terrifying proximity to the front lines. By the late months of 1941, the first waves of female nurses, some still teenagers, were pushed eastward on crowded hospital trains bound for Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. They carried with them small suitcases, a few letters from loved ones, and a mixture of fear and anticipation, unaware that many would not see home again for years, if ever. Training often took place in barracks converted into makeshift nursing schools, where seasoned physicians and senior nurses tried to instill as much knowledge as possible while maintaining a veneer of calm. The young women learned to administer morphine, sterilize equipment under primitive conditions, handle frostbite cases, and improvise when supplies ran out, a frequent occurrence. They practiced lifting wounded soldiers, dealing with mass casualty situations, and managing their own emotional reactions in the face of gore previously unimaginable to them. Yet no simulation could replicate the sensory overload of frontline hospitals. The stench of rotting clothing, the metallic smell of blood, the cries of agony, or the thunder of artillery echoing just beyond the perimeter. Despite these immense challenges, many women embraced the idea that their contribution could save lives, restore dignity to the suffering, and support their nation's war effort during its most critical campaigns. Mobilization also carried with it a strong ideological component. Government propaganda glorified female nurses as symbols of compassion, courage, and national pride. Posters depicted serene young women tending to grateful soldiers, emphasizing purity, heroism, and maternal gentleness. In reality, the women endured back-breaking labor, treated catastrophic injuries, and frequently faced the same frontline threats as combat troops. Nevertheless, such imagery helped to persuade conservative families to allow their daughters to serve, and reassured communities that these women remained within socially acceptable gender roles, even as they moved into war zones. Some nurses internalized this idealized image, believing they could maintain composure and grace under all circumstances. Others quickly abandoned such notions once exposed to the chaos of mass warfare. The urgency of the Eastern Front's medical crisis accelerated the deployment of women to the battlefields. Hospital trains required dozens of nurses to staff their wards as they shuttled back and forth between the front and cities deep in the Reich. Field hospitals demanded round-the-clock staffing. Surgical teams needed assistants who could sterilize instruments, hold lamps over operating tables when electricity failed, and manage blood transfusions. The logistical machinery of war consumed nurses as eagerly as it consumed fuel, ammunition, and rations. By 1942, the presence of women in mobile medical units became a defining feature of the German war effort, with thousands serving in every major sector of the front. One of the defining features of mobilization was the shock experienced by many nurses when first confronting the vastness of the Eastern Front. The distances were immense, the climate punishing, and the constant movement of the front line made stability impossible. Nurses found themselves traveling on convoys over muddy roads, repairing equipment in freezing temperatures, and caring for soldiers suffering from both wounds and exposure. For many, the first winter was a turning point. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees, medical supplies froze, and the sheer volume of frostbite cases overwhelmed medical stations. In these moments, nurses learned that improvisation was not merely helpful, but essential to survival. They used heated stones to warm IV fluids, repurposed torn uniforms as makeshift bandages, and employed whatever resources were available to keep the wounded alive. The mobilization of women also brought them into close contact with military hierarchy. Some officers viewed female nurses with respect and acknowledged their indispensability. Others dismissed them as burdens or distractions. Nurses had to navigate military protocols, assert themselves in male-dominated environments, and prove their competence under pressure. Many did so with quiet determination, earning the admiration of surgeons who came to rely on their endurance and precision. Yet the strain of serving in a domain historically reserved for men also reinforced the sense that their work required exceptional resilience. Another dimension of mobilization involved the camaraderie formed among nurses. Thrown together from different regions, backgrounds, and levels of training, these women built strong bonds, forged through shared hardship. They supported each other during long night shifts, comforted one another after traumatic events, and formed makeshift surrogate families that allowed them to cope with the emotional toll of their duties. Letters home became treasured lifelines, but fellow nurses often became the only people who truly understood what they were living through. Moments of warmth, sharing a cup of hot tea, exchanging stories, or singing quietly during brief respites from duty became emotional anchors amid relentless suffering. The call to serve not only reshaped the lives of the women who answered it, but also redefined societal expectations of what women could or should do during wartime. In stepping into roles traditionally assigned to men, these nurses challenged long-standing gender norms and demonstrated extraordinary capability under the harshest conditions. Although their service was sometimes framed as an extension of domestic caregiving roles, the reality was far more complex. They were emergency responders, frontline medical technicians, psychological caretakers, logistical problem solvers, and, in many cases, the only line of defense between life and death for wounded soldiers. Life and work in field hospitals on the Eastern Front demanded a level of endurance, adaptability, and emotional fortitude rarely acknowledged in traditional accounts of the war. Female nurses assigned to these hospitals found themselves immersed in a world defined by chaos, urgency, and the constant struggle against both time and limited resources. Though military command often portrayed field hospitals as organized centers of medical efficiency, the reality was far more complex. These facilities were frequently overwhelmed, undersupplied, and situated precariously close to active combat zones. The nurses who worked within them navigated long shifts that blended seamlessly from day into night, treating an endless procession of wounded soldiers whose injuries reflected the brutal nature of the Eastern Front's battles. Every moment in these hospitals was a test of skill and determination, as nurses balanced their medical responsibilities with the emotional burden of witnessing suffering on an unimaginable scale. Many field hospitals began as hastily constructed tent complexes or repurposed buildings, barns, schools, factories, converted into makeshift medical centers. As the front advanced or retreated, these hospitals were dismantled and relocated, often under fire. Nurses learned to set up surgical tables in the mud, rig lamps from vehicle batteries when electricity failed, and sterilize instruments over open flames. Winter brought additional hardships. Temperatures routinely plunged well below freezing, causing medical supplies to stiffen, water to ice over, and wounds to freeze before nurses could begin treatment. Inside the hospital tents, stoves struggled to provide warmth, and many nurses worked with numb fingers while breathing air so cold that it crystallized around their scarves. Yet despite these conditions, the medical staff persevered, knowing that the survival of countless soldiers depended on their ability to function under extreme circumstances. A typical day began before sunrise. Nurses awoke to the sound of artillery, aircraft, or the groans of wounded men awaiting attention. Breakfast, if available, was consumed quickly, usually stale bread, thin soup, or black coffee that tasted of burnt metal from field kettles. By the time the nurses entered the treatment areas, the wards were already crowded. Ambulances, horse-drawn carts, and sometimes soldiers carrying comrades on makeshift stretchers arrived steadily throughout the day. The triage area became the chaotic heart of the hospital, where nurses assisted doctors in determining which men required immediate surgery, which could wait, and which were beyond saving. The emotional strain of triage was immense. Nurses learned to recognize the vacant stare of shock, the shallow breaths that preceded death, and the frantic grip of soldiers begging not to be left behind. Despite their compassion, they had to move efficiently, their decisions often determining whether a soldier lived or died. Surgery was a near constant activity. Operating rooms, sometimes nothing more than large tents with wooden tables, hummed with activity for hours on end. Nurses sterilized tools, controlled bleeding, administered anesthesia, and monitored vital signs. They assisted with amputations, shrapnel extractions, suturing, and emergency thoracic or abdominal procedures. Blood pooled on floors, often mixing with mud and snow tracked in from the outside. Despite protective aprons, nurses frequently ended their shifts covered in blood, iodine, and sweat. The smell of chloroform, burnt tissue from cauterizations, and infection permeated the air, clinging to uniforms and hair long after shifts ended. Even seasoned surgeons admitted that, without the tireless support of nurses, the hospitals would have collapsed under the sheer volume of casualties. Beyond surgery, nurses managed countless additional responsibilities. They monitored fever charts, changed dressings, administered medications, cleaned wounds, and provided hydration and nutrition to patients who were too weak to eat on their own. Tetanus and gangrene were constant threats. Even small injuries could become fatal without vigilant care. Nurses learned to handle the emotional outbursts of soldiers suffering from shock or trauma, to soothe dying men with comforting words, and to shield recovering patients from the sights and sounds of others in agony. Many soldiers formed powerful emotional bonds with the nurses, seeing them as symbols of hope amid the horror. Nurses, in turn, often felt responsible for the emotional well-being of their patients, offering kindness where the machinery of war offered none. Night duty brought its own challenges. Field hospitals rarely slept. The front was active at all hours. Nurses moved quietly among rows of beds, checking pulses and temperatures by lantern light, adjusting blankets, and sitting with soldiers who could not sleep. Outside, the rumble of artillery shook the earth, and the shadows of aircraft passed overhead. During enemy bombardments, nurses sometimes had to move patients into trenches or bunkers, shielding them with their own bodies when necessary. Despite the danger, many nurses refused to abandon the wounded, even as shells exploded close enough to tear holes in the tent walls. Some were killed or injured in these attacks, becoming casualties of the very war they had come to resist through healing. Field hospitals were not insulated from the logistical chaos that plagued the entire Eastern Front. Supplies often ran short due to long supply lines, partisan ambushes, or mismanagement. Nurses improvised constantly. When bandages ran out, they boiled and reused torn sheets. When medicine was scarce, they rationed it carefully. When morphine supplies dwindled, they had to make agonizing decisions about who would receive pain relief. Shortages extended to basic necessities such as clean water, food, and heat. Nurses frequently went hungry, choosing to allocate rations to the wounded. Even sleep was a luxury. Many nurses worked 18 to 20-hour shifts during major offensives, collapsing briefly on straw mattresses or wooden crates before being summoned back to duty. The emotional dimension of field hospital work cannot be overstated. Every nurse carried the weight of lives saved and lost. They witnessed the suffering of young men not much older than themselves, heard confessions and final messages for families, and often wrote letters home for soldiers too weak to hold a pen. Grief became a constant companion, yet the nurses still found ways to uplift their patients, offering smiles, telling stories, and celebrating small victories like a fever breaking or a wounded man taking his first steps after surgery. In these fleeting moments, the nurses felt the profound impact of their work, even as the broader war effort remained indifferent to their emotional exhaustion. The environment itself was unforgiving. Summer brought swarms of flies, overwhelming heat, and the stench of decaying material around battlefields. Winter introduced frostbite, frozen equipment, and the constant threat of hypothermia. Mud clogged pathways, making the transport of wounded laborious and dangerous. Rats infested hospitals, chewing through supplies and stirring terror among sleeping patients. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through crowded facilities, placing both patients and medical staff at risk. Nurses often became ill themselves, yet many continued working until they physically collapsed. Despite all hardships, the nurses forged strong support networks among themselves. They shared meager meals, exchanged advice, comforted one another during emotional breakdowns, and celebrated holidays with makeshift decorations and songs. These friendships became a lifeline, helping them cope with trauma that no training could have prepared them for. The psychological toll endured by female nurses on the Eastern Front remains one of the least acknowledged yet most profound aspects of their wartime experience. While their physical labor was grueling and their working conditions were often primitive, it was the emotional strain, the persistent exposure to extreme human suffering, death, fear, and moral dilemmas that left the deepest and most enduring scars. Nurses entered the war with varying degrees of preparedness, but almost none were ready for the psychological landscape awaiting them on the front. From the moment they arrived at field hospitals or aid stations, they were immersed in a world where life and death existed side by side, and where their actions could mean the difference between hope and despair for countless wounded soldiers. Every day they were confronted with the raw realities of war, shattered bodies, desperate pleas for help, and the final breaths of young men whose families would never see them again. The emotional weight of these experiences was relentless, shaping the nurses' identities, haunting their dreams, and influencing the rest of their lives. One of the most overwhelming sources of psychological stress came from the sheer volume of casualties. During major offensives or retreats, hundreds of wounded soldiers arrived within hours, each requiring immediate attention. Nurses moved frantically among stretchers, doing everything possible to stabilize men who were bleeding, burned, mutilated, or in shock. The urgency of triage forced them to make difficult decisions: who could be saved, who needed surgery immediately, and who would not survive regardless of their efforts. These decisions left deep emotional bruises. Nurses often remembered the faces of men they had to leave for later treatment, or the ones whose hands they held as they died. Many recounted the crushing guilt they felt when resources were scarce, a lack of morphine, surgeons, or time, and a soldier slipped away while they were helping someone else. Such moments etched themselves into their consciousness, replaying in quiet hours and long after the war had ended. The constant proximity to death created a psychological environment unlike anything these women had previously experienced. Some nurses developed coping mechanisms to shield themselves emotionally, detaching during procedures, limiting personal conversations with patients, or focusing obsessively on technical tasks. Others, particularly younger nurses or those serving their first months on the front, found themselves overwhelmed by feelings of helplessness and grief. They listened as soldiers cried out for their mothers, begged for the pain to stop, or whispered their final wishes. Nurses wrote letters for dying men, held their hands, and tried to offer comfort in their last minutes. These moments, though compassionate, carved deep wounds into the nurses' hearts, wounds that medical training had not prepared them to bear. In addition to the emotional strain of caring for the wounded, nurses faced the constant threat of bombardment, raids, and encirclement. Field hospitals were often situated close to the front, making them targets for artillery and air attacks. At any moment, the quiet hum of medical activity could be shattered by the shriek of incoming shells. Nurses learned to recognize the difference between distant fire and imminent danger, yet the unpredictable nature of combat kept them in a state of chronic anxiety. Some hospitals were overrun during enemy advances, forcing nurses to flee with only minutes to gather what they could. Others endured near misses that tore holes through tents, shattered windows, or peppered the surrounding area with shrapnel. For nurses, the fear was double: fear for their own lives and fear of being unable to protect the wounded in their care. This constant tension contributed to a state now recognized as chronic wartime stress, though at the time it was rarely acknowledged or treated. Another profound emotional burden came from the moral conflicts nurses encountered. They were bound by professional and ethical obligations to treat all wounded, yet the ideology of the war, and at times direct orders, clashed with these principles. Some nurses faced situations where they treated prisoners of war under scrutiny from officers who viewed such compassion with suspicion. Others struggled with the tension between their personal beliefs and the harsh realities they witnessed. For many, war shattered previously held notions of heroism or national pride. The nurses saw up close the human cost of battles celebrated in propaganda, and they bore witness to the fragility of life regardless of nationality, rank, or ideology. This moral dissonance created a heavy inner conflict that lingered long after the war's end. The lack of psychological support compounded the mental strain. Unlike modern military medical personnel, nurses on the Eastern Front had no access to counselors, therapy, or structured debriefing. The expectation was simple: endure. Women were encouraged to suppress their emotions and maintain composure regardless of circumstances. Crying was viewed as weakness. Fear was something to be hidden. Many nurses therefore internalized their trauma, sharing their pain only with close colleagues or in rare moments of vulnerability. At night, when their shifts ended, some retreated to their bunks and wept silently. Others wrote in journals or whispered their fears to trusted friends. But many carried their emotional burdens alone, unsure whom they could trust or how to express the depth of their suffering. The bonds formed between nurses became a vital psychological lifeline. These women, thrown together by war, created emotional support networks that helped them survive the unrelenting pressures of service. They comforted each other after particularly traumatic surgeries, shared stories to lighten the mood, and reminded one another of their purpose. Some celebrated small victories together: the recovery of a severely wounded soldier, a moment of laughter shared with patients, or a rare break in the workload. These moments of connection provided a semblance of normalcy and warmth amid the otherwise bleak environment. Many nurses later recalled that their friendships were the only thing that allowed them to cope with the emotional strain. Sleep deprivation contributed heavily to the psychological burden. Long shifts, nighttime bombardments, and the constant flow of casualties meant that many nurses survived on only a few hours of rest. Exhaustion intensified emotional fragility. Small setbacks felt devastating. Minor disagreements escalated into arguments, and the already overwhelming workload became even more difficult to manage. Some nurses experienced recurring nightmares or intrusive memories, symptoms now recognized as early signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet the demands of war offered no time for recovery. Each day brought new challenges that forced them to push their emotional limits further. Letters from home provided essential emotional relief, but they could also deepen the emotional burden. Some nurses felt torn between their duty on the front and their longing for family. Others felt misunderstood when loved ones expressed pride without comprehending the horrors the nurses faced daily. Some soldiers formed emotional attachments to the nurses, seeking comfort and human connection. While these relationships sometimes provided warmth amid suffering, they also created emotional complexities that nurses struggled to navigate, particularly when patients died or were transferred abruptly. Despite all hardships, many nurses developed remarkable emotional resilience. They learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness, to celebrate each life saved, and to take pride in their ability to endure where others might falter. For some, the work provided a sense of purpose stronger than anything they had known before. For others, it became a source of trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Encounters with the Red Army and the numerous dangers that unfolded behind the lines formed one of the most harrowing and unpredictable aspects of a female nurse's service on the Eastern Front. While the battlefield itself was a place of constant threat, the instability of the front line, The rapid advances and retreats, and the ever-present possibility of being overrun or isolated, created a psychological and physical environment filled with perpetual uncertainty. For the women serving as nurses, often unarmed, overworked, and responsible not only for themselves but also for wounded soldiers unable to walk, the approach of the Red Army was both a looming shadow and a chaotic reality that unfolded again and again over the course of the war. The shifting tides of conflict meant that hospitals could be frontline facilities one moment and suddenly find themselves behind enemy lines the next, blurring the distinction between combat zones and supposed rear area safety. Fear, survival instincts, and duty clashed in these moments, shaping experiences that would haunt many nurses long after the end of the war. From the first months of the invasion, nurses heard terrifying rumors about the Red Army. Stories of brutality, reprisals, and harsh treatment filtered through the ranks, creating an atmosphere of dread whenever Soviet forces advanced. While propaganda exaggerated some accounts, many stories were true, and the danger for female personnel was very real. These fears were intensified by the knowledge that hospitals, despite being marked with Red Cross insignia, were often seen not as protected spaces, but as strategic targets or sources of intelligence and supplies. As Soviet forces pushed westward, in periods of counteroffensive, nurses lived with the constant awareness that the enemy could appear at any moment, sometimes without warning, sometimes announced only by the distant rumble of artillery or the frantic arrival of retreating troops. During retreats, hospitals often had to be evacuated under extreme pressure. Nurses were tasked with moving wounded soldiers onto trucks, carts, trains, or even makeshift sleds, racing against time to prevent patients from being captured or abandoned. These evacuations were chaotic, conducted amid smoke, distant gunfire, and the roar of engines. Some nurses remembered the agonizing choices that had to be made: who could be moved quickly, who was too gravely injured to survive the journey, and how to comfort those who begged not to be left behind. Many nurses stayed behind voluntarily with severely wounded men, knowing the risks but unable to abandon their patients. Others were forced to flee under orders, the guilt of leaving men behind weighing on them for years. Encounters with Red Army soldiers varied widely depending on circumstances, location, and the emotional state of the advancing troops. Some nurses were captured in large groups and treated according to military regulations, questioned briefly, and then marched to holding areas. In other cases, especially during rapid, violent breakthroughs, chaos reigned. Nurses recalled moments where they hid in forests, barns, cellars, or abandoned houses, praying they would not be discovered. Some disguised themselves by removing insignia or dressing in men's clothing to avoid drawing attention. A few attempted to escape in small groups, navigating through unfamiliar terrain, dodging patrols, and relying on luck or the kindness of civilians. Others remained in their hospitals, trusting that the Red Cross markings would offer some degree of protection, only to find that the Soviet soldiers who stormed in were exhausted, enraged, and traumatized by what they had endured in battle. The Soviet advance often followed periods of brutal fighting, and Red Army soldiers had suffered immense losses, starvation, and atrocities themselves. This combustible mix of trauma and rage created an environment where discipline sometimes broke down. Nurses faced threats ranging from rough questioning and intimidation to far more serious dangers. Some were assaulted, others were forced to witness executions or looting, and many were stripped of personal belongings, watches, rings, letters, or mementos from home. Despite these dangers, there were also accounts of Soviet medics or officers who intervened to protect women, recognizing their medical roles and insisting on humane treatment. These rare acts of compassion offered brief glimpses of shared humanity amidst overwhelming brutality. Behind the lines, dangers were not limited to enemy encounters. Retreats often forced hospitals into vast stretches of land filled with partisans, deserters, and desperate civilians. Nurses traveling with convoys risked ambush, sniper fire, or robbery. Partisan activity grew more organized as the war progressed, and many groups saw German medical convoys as strategic targets for disruption. Nurses recalled bullets tearing through canvas covers, explosions rocking supply trucks, and frantic attempts to shield wounded men as drivers pushed vehicles to their limits. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. These women had no weapons beyond their medical kits, no training in escape tactics, and no certainty that reinforcements would arrive in time. In addition to human threats, the natural environment posed its own dangers. Nurses evacuating hospitals during winter faced temperatures that could freeze exposed skin within minutes. Many suffered frostbite while carrying stretchers through snowdrifts or standing for hours beside wounded men loaded onto trains. During spring and autumn, mud turned roads into swamps, bogging down vehicles and forcing nurses to push or walk for miles. Storms, snow, and darkness turned evacuations into nightmarish ordeals. Some nurses became separated from their units, wandering for days before finding safety. Others never made it back, succumbing to the elements or disappearing without a trace in the vastness of the Eastern Front. Even when hospitals were not under direct threat, the proximity of the Red Army influenced daily routines. The nurses lived with constant anxiety, listening to radios for updates, scanning the horizon for distant fires, and deciphering the expressions of soldiers who returned from reconnaissance missions. They packed and repacked their belongings, prepared emergency kits, and rehearsed evacuation procedures. In some hospitals, secrecy became essential. Medical staff dimmed lights at night, hid supplies underground, and constructed improvised shelters to protect patients in case of sudden bombardment. Every sound, distant engine noise, the crack of branches, the whistle of artillery, triggered instinctive fear. This persistent state of hypervigilance took a psychological toll on nurses already carrying the emotional burdens. Despite the overwhelming dangers, nurses continued their work with remarkable courage. Some adapted to the constant threat, developing an almost instinctive awareness of danger. They learned when to stay calm, when to move quickly, and when to hide. Others relied on hope, faith, or the solidarity of their colleagues to face each new challenge. Many later reflected that the strength they found in these moments surprised even themselves. Though terrified, they stayed with their patients, upheld their duties, and demonstrated extraordinary resilience. At times, encounters with Red Army soldiers revealed moments of unexpected humanity. There were instances where Soviet soldiers recognized the nurses' exhaustion, offering food, cigarettes, or even assistance. Some soldiers respected the neutrality of medical personnel, stepping aside to allow wounded men to be treated. Although such moments were rare compared to the violence that characterized most encounters, they served as solemn reminders that war often forced ordinary people into roles and actions they would never have chosen in peace. As the front continued to shift and the German army fell into strategic withdrawal, these encounters and dangers intensified. As the war dragged into its later years, the conditions faced by female nurses on the Eastern Front deteriorated with alarming speed. The early months of relative mobility and manageable supply lines were replaced by an environment defined by retreat, scarcity, chaos, and overwhelming human suffering. Nurses who had once operated in semi-functional hospitals found themselves working in bombed-out buildings, frozen barns, makeshift field stations, and open-air encampments where medical care was improvised from whatever scraps could be gathered. The collapse of the Eastern Front was not a single moment, but a prolonged unraveling, one that nurses experienced not only as witnesses, but as participants who were compelled daily to keep men alive, even as the military machine around them disintegrated. The winter months, already brutal in previous years, became nearly unbearable by the last phases of the war. Fuel shortages meant that hospitals went unheeded, forcing nurses to perform delicate medical procedures while their hands were numb from cold. Water froze in basins, bandages stiffened in supply crates, and medical instruments had to be warmed over tiny stoves or held between palms before use. Some nurses worked with frostbitten fingers wrapped in cloth, refusing to be relieved even when their own skin cracked and bled. The wounded suffered terribly. Many arrived with limbs frozen beyond saving, requiring immediate amputation. And yet the scarcity of anesthesia, the shortage of surgeons, and the constant threat of enemy bombardment made even life-saving procedures a matter of desperation rather than precision. Food shortages also grew increasingly severe. The nurses were often fed last, after wounded soldiers, doctors, and guards had been accounted for. Their meals consisted of watery soups, a crust of stale bread, or whatever could be scavenged from retreating supply trains. Some nurses survived on a few hundred calories a day, fainting from exhaustion while still attempting to carry stretchers or administer injections. Malnutrition weakened their immune systems, making them vulnerable to typhus, dysentery, trench fever, and respiratory diseases, illnesses that spread rapidly through overcrowded hospitals. Yet, even in sickness, many remained at their posts, terrified that abandoning wounded men would mean leaving them to die alone. As the Red Army strengthened its momentum and German lines were forced repeatedly backward, hospitals were packed far beyond capacity. Rooms meant for 10 patients now held 50. Corridors were lined with stretchers. Stairwells, storage rooms, and administrative offices were converted into makeshift wards. Nurses were assigned dozens more patients than they could realistically care for. They slept in shifts lasting an hour or less, often resting on the floor beside the wounded so they could respond instantly to calls for help. Some lost all sense of time, working through day and night without realizing when one ended and the other began. In these conditions, triage became brutally necessary. Nurses were forced to make decisions they would have once considered unthinkable, prioritizing those who had a chance to survive and offering only comfort to those who did not. Sanitation collapsed completely in many areas. With water scarce and overused facilities failing, infection rates surged. Some hospitals lacked clean dressings, forcing nurses to wash and reuse bandages despite the risks. Lice infestations became universal. Uniforms crawled with parasites, and mattresses were burned whenever possible to slow their spread. The smell of infection, gangrene, decay, sweat, and smoke became a constant presence, so overwhelming that many nurses later said they could never forget it for the rest of their lives. Despite constant exhaustion, they scrubbed floors, boiled water when available, and disinfected instruments as best they could, even when the basic supplies needed for sanitation were long gone. Morale among soldiers collapsed just as rapidly as the front itself. Nurses found themselves treating men who were not only physically wounded, but psychologically shattered. Shell shock, panic attacks, and emotional breakdowns became common. Some soldiers begged the nurses to help them escape, to hide them, or to write final letters to loved ones. Others lashed out in despair, breaking down in tears or violently resisting treatment. Nurses bore witness to the unraveling of an army, one that had once advanced with confidence and now was sustained only by fear, habit, and the faint hope of survival. The nurses themselves were not immune. They struggled with nightmares, sudden moments of uncontrollable shaking, and feelings of helplessness. Still they worked. The alternative, doing nothing, felt far worse. Meanwhile, the chain of command grew increasingly unstable. As officers abandoned posts, retreated without orders, or were killed in sudden Soviet advances, nurses found themselves taking on organizational tasks previously handled by military personnel. They coordinated evacuations, inventoried dwindling supplies, and communicated with local civilians or other units. In some cases, nurses served as the only stable force within collapsing outposts, maintaining operations when chaos threatened to overwhelm everything. Evacuations during the final phase of the Eastern Front's collapse were among the most desperate in the entire war. Trains packed with wounded were targeted by aircraft, convoys of ambulances and supply trucks were ambushed or stuck in mud, roads clogged with refugees became impassable. Nurses carried men on their backs through snow, mud, or burning debris. They laid wounded soldiers on doors, sleds, or farm carts when stretchers ran out. They shielded men from shrapnel using their own bodies. Many nurses themselves became casualties during these evacuations, killed by artillery, caught in explosions, or frozen during long marches. Yet the majority refused to abandon their work, even when their superiors urged them to save themselves. Civilians caught in the chaos added another layer of complexity. Villages crowded with refugees begged hospitals for help, overwhelming medical staff who already lacked supplies. Nurses treated women and children suffering from frostbite, hunger, and injuries inflicted during bombardments or partisan conflicts. Some left behind their own rations to feed children who had been separated from their parents. The compassion they showed in these moments created bonds of trust with civilians, even when language barriers made communication difficult. Some nurses later said, helping civilians was the only part of the war that made them feel human. The collapse of the Eastern Front reached its peak when German units became fragmented and isolated. Nurses found themselves cut off from command, surrounded by Soviet advances, or abandoned in hospitals that had exhausted every resource. For many, the final days were a blur of frantic activity, treating as many as possible, destroying sensitive documents, and preparing for the inevitable arrival of the Red Army. They burned personal letters to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, concealed their uniforms under civilian clothing, and hid wounded men who begged not to be captured. The tension during these final hours was unbearable, filled with uncertainty, fear, and the crushing weight of exhaustion. The end of the war did not mark the end of the struggle for the female nurses who had served on the Eastern Front. The collapse of the German military, the chaos of surrender, and the harsh realities of captivity or displacement became the opening chapters of a new ordeal, one that tested their endurance in ways distinct from battlefield suffering. For many, the aftermath of the war was an uncertain journey through internment camps, interrogation centers, refugee convoys, and devastated cities, where survival depended on resilience, resourcefulness, and the fragile hope of eventual return home. Those who survived the war carried memories that would remain vivid for decades, shaping the stories they told and the legacy they left behind. Many nurses were captured by the Red Army during the final months. Their experiences varied widely. Some were processed in an orderly manner and sent to prisoner camps, while others endured brutal interrogations or harsh conditions during forced marches. Camps were overcrowded, food was scarce, and disease spread quickly. Many nurses had to perform hard labor, cutting trees, repairing roads, or cleaning facilities, despite being physically weakened by months of starvation and exhaustion. Yet even in captivity, some continued to act as caregivers, tending to fellow prisoners with whatever limited supplies they could obtain. The compassion that had defined their wartime service did not disappear, even when they themselves were treated with suspicion or hostility. For those who managed to avoid capture, the immediate post-war period was one of dislocation and uncertainty. Many walked hundreds of kilometers across ruined landscapes, moving through territories controlled by shifting factions. They encountered scattered military remnants, displaced civilians, and abandoned towns stripped of resources. Some reached their original homes only to find them destroyed or occupied by new families. Others learned that parents, siblings, or spouses had been killed, deported, or lost somewhere in the vast refugee movements that swept across Europe. In many cases, returning home offered no comfort, only a painful reminder of how much had been lost. When nurses did reunite with their families, the emotional complexity of their experiences made reintegration difficult. Many civilians had no understanding of the harsh conditions on the Eastern Front, and the nurses' stories were often met with disbelief or discomfort. Some suppressed their memories to avoid judgment or painful reminders, while others wrote diaries or gave testimonies to preserve their experiences before time blurred the details. The psychological wounds ran deep. Recurring nightmares, anxiety, emotional detachment, and guilt became lifelong companions. Because post-war society focused largely on the roles of soldiers and political leaders, the suffering of female medical personnel remained largely invisible. Countries recovering from the war were often reluctant to discuss the experiences of those who had served with the German military, regardless of their role. Female nurses found themselves trapped in a moral gray zone, victims of war, yet associated with a defeated and widely condemned regime. Many were denied official recognition, pensions, or medical support. Some faced suspicion or hostility simply for having worn a uniform, regardless of the compassionate nature of their service. As a result, many lived quietly, rebuilding their lives in anonymity, while carrying memories too painful to share openly. Still, in the decades following the war, some women chose to document their stories. Their diaries, letters, and oral histories form one of the most important sources for understanding the human dimensions of the Eastern Front. These testimonies reveal the courage, suffering, and moral complexity of their service. They speak of nights spent operating under lantern light while shells fell nearby, of evacuations carried out in snowstorms, of patients who clung to life through sheer will, and of the friendships formed among nurses who depended on one another for survival. In sharing these stories, the nurses ensured that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. These testimonies also shed light on how deeply the war shaped their post-war lives. Some suffered permanent physical damage from frostbite, disease, or untreated injuries. Others bore emotional scars, flashbacks triggered by the sound of aircraft, panic at the smell of disinfectant, or overwhelming grief when recalling the faces of dying soldiers they had comforted. A few found purpose in working as civilian nurses after the war, channeling their wartime experience into careers of healing and service. But even these women often struggled with the contrast between peacetime hospitals and the chaotic, brutal conditions of the front. In the broader context of history, the legacy of the female nurses on the Eastern Front remains both profound and under-recognized. They played an essential role in maintaining military medical infrastructure, often under conditions that defied imagination. They demonstrated extraordinary resilience, compassion, and dedication even when confronted with starvation, bombardment, exhaustion, and the imminent threat of capture. Their contributions were not measured in victories or strategic gains, but in lives saved, suffering eased, and dignity preserved in moments of chaos. Today, historians increasingly acknowledge these women as key participants in the wartime narrative. By examining their letters, diaries, and recorded testimonies, scholars highlight the vital role of medical personnel in sustaining armies and the heavy emotional burden they carried. Their experiences also serve as a reminder of the deeply gendered nature of war, revealing how women navigated danger, trauma, and moral dilemmas in environments dominated by violence and destruction. Ultimately, the story of the nurses on the Eastern Front is one of endurance, sacrifice, and humanity amidst unimaginable hardship. Their legacy is not defined by the regime they served under, but by the compassion they showed to the wounded, the courage with which they faced danger, and the inner strength that carried them through some of the darkest moments of the 20th century. In preserving their testimonies, we honor not only their service, but the broader truth that even in the midst of a devastating conflict, acts of care can illuminate the enduring resilience of the human spirit.